Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to the Witches Symposium. I'm your hostess, Snappy, and I'm joined by my co hosts, Dion and Gunk Wretch. Today, we have a very special guest with us. We have with us today Chris Bennett, renowned cannabis activist, historian, author, and researcher. How are you, Chris?
I'm doing well, thank you very much. Snappy, how about yourself?
Fantastic. We're so excited to have you here today because we were just talking beforehand and we kind of share the same sort of goals in a lot of this. And we're really trying to, on our channel, explore entheogens and promote the use of entheogens and their place back within spirituality and in human culture. And that seems to be like a massive theme from throughout your career. So, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us about how you got into cannabis research and whatnot?
Yeah, sure. I got into cannabis research in 1990. I was living out in Ucluelet on Vancouver Island there, and the whole Clackwood Sound controversy was going on. And I found out about industrial hemp and started reading about cannabis. And I had this really powerful spiritual experience under the influence of cannabis one night, and I was trying to understand that. And I thought, well, if there was anything to that, then other people will have had something similar. You know what I mean? So I started collecting everything I found on cannabis and religion while promoting the industrial uses of hemp. To save the forest and that sort of thing, and producing hemp seed food products. I had a business, Mom and Nica's hemp seed treats in the 90s. I sold those all over North America and just kind of kept researching it. And this led to 5 books that I've written now over that 30 odd year span.
Yeah, it's incredible. Like we have your Amazon page here. I highly recommend everyone go check out Chris's books. Because you're writing on your cannabis is sort of your focus, but as we said, a lot of these are just incredible histories. You have cannabis in the Soma Solution, where you dig into the Vedas and you talk about all of this mystery behind Soma, and you put forward cannabis. We have the book we're going to be talking about today, Cannabis and the Lost Sacrament of the Ancient World, which you just released an updated version on May 15th, and we're going to be seeing a hardcover coming out soon. And another book, which is a real pleasure for me, is Liber 420, where you dig into cannabis and its use throughout the occult and magical history of the Western world. So you have quite the diverse writing background on this subject and how it relates to spirituality and religion.
Well, it's a
Really,
fascinating thing, like one of the nice things about studying cannabis is there's like some really great archaeological evidence. And the name cannabis, the root word, goes back to like the oldest sort of language roots, Proto-Indo-European. Cannabis, the root word for cannabis. And it's, so you can kind of trace the language references as well in ancient texts and things like that. A lot of it's been identified in a number of different languages. So you're not relying on speculation as much as, say, as some of the other entheogenic substances, like, say, when people try to place mushrooms in Christianity or the Old Testament period and that type of thing. Usually it's based on sort of more interpretive things. But here, we have the Tellerad evidence as well as other archaeological evidence from the Holy Land and strong textual indications as well.
Right. So let's just jump right into it then, because you just released your new book, Cannabis, Lost Sacrament of the Ancient World. And you begin with this research site at Tellerad. And this is a huge deal because this is when was this done? Like 8th century was when the site was, right?
Yeah. 8th century, 7th century BCE was when the site was canceled. And
Okay.
and that's why it's so well preserved, just because it was purposely hidden away. They knocked the altars over, they built a floor over top of it immediately, and then repurposed the area. And so, because of that, everything was so well preserved, right? You know what I mean? That's why there's these resins that they could test on these altars. But it's an important timepiece in Israeli history. What's associated with that cancelization, and this has to do with monotheistic. They call them reforms, monotheistic reforms. Reform is actually not the proper term because they're not going back to something older. Monotheism at this time in ancient Israel was an innovation. not a return to a more previous state that they'd derived from. Archaeological evidence is pretty clear from the Holy Land that throughout that whole period it was polytheistic.
Right. No, that's such an interesting, that's a very interesting point, right? Because when I was reading your book, what becomes really evident, especially when you start to dig into the Asherah and the Kadeshim, is the parallels to the cultures around it.
Mm-hmm.
There are similar practices that were done by the Canaanites. You have similar practices that are done by the Philistines. In Syria, by the Greeks, we have these characters like Kybele and Attis that are kind of like really prominent all throughout that region. So this incredible kind of washing away of all of those roots is such a huge incredible thing of history. Like, why do you think that is? Why do you think that happened, and when abouts?
Well, in the case of the Jews, which I think later affected, what started there, I think later affected the whole world, really. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There was like a number of things that drove like the monotheistic thing. You got to remember, like, people should realize that before, say, 8th century BCE, the archaeological evidence was that Yahweh had a wife, Asherah. There's textual inscriptions that refer to Yahweh and Asherah, and illustrations of them together and things like that, which I reproduce in the book. And this is all over the place in the Holy Land and outlying areas, And not just Asherah, but Baal was worshipped alongside Yahweh, the biblical God, and El, the god of Canaan, and stuff. And a lot of this is kind of condensed down into how Yahweh ended up in the monotheistic period, right? Tel Arad's interesting because it's one of the sites that is known for the combined worship of Yahweh and his Asherah, which is his wife, because they found, like, we know it was like a holy site of Yahweh because they found an inscription that said House of Yahweh. And the place itself was built on the same style as the temple in Jerusalem as described in the biblical text, but on a smaller scale. It's called like a smaller version of the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem, And we should probably talk a little bit about this site. It's a temple site, but within this temple site, there's a little room called the Holy of Holies, which is about the size of a broom closet, probably 4 or 5 feet wide by about 8 feet deep. And it was probably, not much more than head height. And inside this altar room, there were 2 altars, side by side, and probably at one time 2 standing stones, although only one remained when they rediscovered the temple, but the indications are that there were originally 2. And on one of these altars was burned frankincense, and one of these other altars was burned cannabis. And they know this from the resins that were, burnt over and over again on there, and were condensed on the tops of the altars. And not just cannabis, but cannabis resins. So a hashish-like product that had to be burnt on manure, which was a very common lighting fuel, cooking fuel and stuff back in those days, still is used in some areas of the world. And so this was like a little hot box type chamber that you could totally fill with smoke. They didn't have pipes. There's no archaeological evidence of agent pipes or anything like that from this region. Pipes are kind of a new world discovery. The common way to do it was inhalation, right? And this is what we see also with groups like the Scythians, who would burn cannabis on braziers and little tents to hold in the smoke, and other cultures that were practicing suffumigation with cannabis. And so this site is particularly interesting because not only was it the House of Yahweh and built on the same sort of design as the temple in Israel, but also there was a lot of Asherah figurines discovered in the same site. And so it's known at this time, the time of its cancellation, Hezekiah was going around and destroying Asherah temples and other competing temples, Baal temples, killing off the priests and priestesses. And he also ripped out, and these reforms extended into the temple in Jerusalem. And he's described as pulling out the Asherim, the symbol of Asherah, inside the temple, as well as a brazen serpent which Moses made. which the people of Israel had been burning incense to. So it was destroyed as well. And so incense burning is kind of tied up with these reforms, right? And so this is likely what's taken place. Now, there's multiple reasons for this, but a real big one was that Israel, the kingdom of Israel at this time, was being continually under threat by much larger kingdoms, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and the Assyrians eventually overthrew the Israelites, and the Babylonians eventually overthrew Jerusalem, right? And in this situation there, in the ancient world, there's no division between politics and religion, right? There's all these polytheistic cults. There's the kingdom and the king, and the advisors. And whichever cult has the ear of the king and the advisors, that's who's going to have the most power. But, trying to control that when you have different agendas from different cults and they all want things, is pretty tough to do, I would imagine, and I think that monotheism was a way of consolidating worship and control of the people in face of these much larger adversaries. And so there may have been some attempt to install monotheism, but it wasn't ever successfully installed. Even at the time of Hezekiah, we see the people return right back to the worship of Asherah. And by the time of Josiah, his son, who had similar reforms, this continues, right? And in Josiah's case, they claim to have found, they were reconstructing the Temple of Solomon. Now, Solomon, even in the biblical account, is described as polytheistic, and he's condemned for worshiping the goddess in the high places and burning incense to her, swayed by his foreign wives, right? And so he's a polytheistic type of figure. But they say they were reconstructing the Temple of Solomon, and they knocked the wall over, and they found the book of Deuteronomy, the second book of the law. And they open it up, and it says all these other temples, the Asherah temples, all this stuff's got to go. It's, we only practice this way. And so another bout of reforms begins to take place. But then not long after this, they're wiped out by the Babylonians and redistributed. So monotheism didn't take place there either. And Cannabis is kind of wound up with this. What's really interesting to me about Telerad is, for decades prior to the discovery of this archaeological evidence, through the etymological and linguistic work of the anthropologist Sula Bennett, I had been following the idea that this Hebrew term cannabosum, also sometimes just canna, which appears about 5 times in the Old Testament. It appears more than that, but Sula Bennett focused on these 5 particular references. And it tells a story of a plant that was used in the Holy of Holies and then eventually became prohibited because of its association with the goddess and people burning incense to the Queen of Heaven. And so these 2 stories really match, so I'm saying that Telerad turns the hypothesis that the Hebrew term cannabosum references cannabis into a factual situation. And a large part of the book is trying to match that up. And this is something that I looked at earlier. I wrote another book in 2001, and that was Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible. And a lot of the the goddess worship, Asherah stuff, the Quadashim, and a lot of these other, the fertility rites and stuff like that, they were really discussed in that book in much more detail. But at that time, the idea that Yahweh was partnered with a goddess was really radical. And that was one of the things after Arad. And then I realized, as I heard about these stories of Arad, and people were mostly comparing it to the situation in the Temple of Jerusalem and saying this is an indication of temple worship. But then other people were saying, oh no, this is like actually an example of the sort of heretical worship that Hezekiah was canceling out. And when you take a look at these Hebrew references to cannabosum, what it shows is that both these parties are correct, but we're dealing with different periods in time. And in the beginning, it is initially part of the Holy of Holies and the temple worship, but because of its association with the earlier polytheistic practices and the wife of God, Asherah, it becomes prohibited. Now, the prohibition of something like cannabis through history, that's, definitely got a lot of effects and repercussions. But when you take a look at the suppression of the goddess, and especially the culture around the goddess, the acceptance of trans people, the kind of motherly love that it puts out, focus on that, in the culture, and you take that part right out, and you focus solely on the patriarchy, well, you end up with a mess like the mess we're in right now. Right. As we sit on the precipice of world destruction, you know what I mean?
100%.
For sure.
You know what I mean? And that's what Asher is Mother Earth, man.
100%. One thing that just struck me about what you were saying there is, like, when I was reading your book and you're talking about cannabis and the cannabis and, a lot of this, I remember when I was in university, I have a degree in religion studies, everyone was talking about calamus. And you bring this up, but even if it was calamus is entheogenic, number one. But the biggest striking point to me is that we have all of this representative in every other culture surrounding them. Every other culture has a prominent use of cannabis and has a mother goddess cult. So why would Israel be different?
5 references to the cannabosum that Sula Bennett points out to, it appears alongside frankincense. Just like in that temple thing, and the descriptions of canna, they don't. Calamus was a common marsh fruit. This grows in Israel, and the references, and this is also something they say about the Telerad cannabis, is it was imported, and in the Ezekiel reference to canna, it comes in on a caravan. And in the Jeremiah reference, he's like, "What do I care for your canna from a distant land? Your incense of Sheba does not please me." And so it's just directly, and this is important because one of the points I differentiate with Sula Bennett on is she thought it was a Semitic term that made it into Western languages and stuff like that, but it originated as a Semitic term. But myself and Carl Ruck as well holds this view, Professor Carl Ruck, hold that the term is an Indo-European term, canna, and then it came in on the trade routes with that name, and then was adapted into the Hebrew culture with that name, and in the same sort of ceremonial context. As I mentioned, Indo-European use with the Scythians, they would use it in funerary rituals. They burn it in braziers, catches and tents. And in Indo-European culture, the indication is that this goes back to 3500 BC in regions like the Ukraine and Romania, where there's evidence of these sort of funerary rituals with cannabis. And it extended widely through Indo-European culture, even up into China, where Indo-Europeans were settled in central China, the Gushi culture, until the Han Chinese, the indigenous Chinese, chased them out of there about 4th, 5th century BCE. Something wound up with the disappearance of Haoma as well.
Right. No, so much craziness going on. But one thing that was really interesting that you were talking about that really connects to what Wretch does is you were mentioning how a lot of these rites, they're done within the Holy of Holies, right? Which is a room that you're going in that's going to be like a sensory deprivation tank almost, and then they're lighting large amounts of incense so that they're creating like a hotbox effect where they would then be hallucinating visions, having these divinatory experiences, right?
I don't know, like about full-on hallucinations. I don't think that's necessarily necessary, but let's take like the account as depicted in Exodus 30:23. Moses makes this holy anointing oil with about 9 pounds of cannabis mixed with myrrh and cinnamon into about 1.5 gallons of olive oil. And olive oil is a very good carrier for THC. And he goes into the tent of the meeting because they're on the road then, right? You know what I mean? They have a movable temple. And the tent of the meeting, much like the Scythian tents, is a little enclosed area, much like the Telerad temple. And then he covers himself in this oil. THC is fatty soluble as well. So a lot of references to topical cannabis in the ancient world as well. And he places some of this oil on the altar of incense. And then he speaks to the Lord in the pillar of smoke over the altar of incense. The pillar of smoke is actually referred to as the Shekinah later in later Hebrew writings, and actually represents the physical presence of God in the temple. So unless that pillar of smoke's there, and then Moses, he focuses on a question: what are we going to do? What are we going going to do? And eventually a voice comes back out of the smoke. This is what you tell the people. And then he goes outside. They don't see or hear God. He goes outside. And this is what the Lord your God says. And so we can really see, cannabis with its receptor sites in the areas of higher thinking and memory, activating those areas. Many people uncomfortably start to hear kind of voices and things like that, get overwhelmed with the inner chatter. Many ways is cannabis is a door to the subconscious and the unconscious. You know what I mean?
100%.
Yeah.
And so it kind of opens that up, you know what I mean? And this is why I think it plays such an important role. It's not just, as you were saying, not just the Hebrews, but Zoroastrian references to cannabis-infused wines. We've got Asterion. The Asterion references really make it clear the temple use is described as one of the main items for the sacred rites. Large amounts of offerings to the temple of Inanna, large, references to its use in the direct use in the cult of Ishtar and Asherah, so it's like pretty important. And I think this is also what led to, like, in the reference to kind of in Isaiah, it's like God's like, Isaiah shows up like Moses with questions and looking for some answers and help, and God's like, you have not bred any canon frankincense for me, but you burdened me with your sins and iniquities. And it's because, like, cannabis, there's all these different temples there, right? And hey, the gods respond a lot better when you burn this herb in the temple than when you don't, so it's like sought after, man. It's a commodity, you know what I mean? Like, it wasn't even being produced there, they don't think. It was like a refined resin product imported that came in on these trade routes and helped you to speak to the gods. And that's why all these different cultures and temples wanted it. And so this created, another reason for monotheism over polytheism is, like, we've got all these offerings and they're going to all these other guys. And that's what we want here at the central temple at the kingdom where we can use it, so there's a real desire for control there. But there's a better scene in Isaiah, which I tie back to that one by the similar references to sins and iniquities, which appears in both of the passages. And in that one, it says, and the temple was filled with smoke. And the seraphim flew unto me with a live coal in hands, which he had taken with tongs from off the altar. And he laid it upon my lips, and lo, my sins and iniquities were removed. And so here we see the sins and iniquities are relieved. You know what I mean? When he showed up with no cannabis and frankincense, it wasn't relieved. But here they're in a temple. They're burning stuff on the altar. We know they burned cannabis on the altar. The guy grabs with tongs a burning coal to the altar. He holds it up to Isaiah's mouth like a bro with a hot knife. And he takes a big hit, and boom, Shiva, just like a sadhu in India, sins and iniquities are relieved, And so this is like a paramount power to the Christian sacrament, you know what I mean? This is a substance that releases you of that type of thing, just like cannabis in India would, is better than 1,000 horse sacrifices, an offering of cannabis in some texts, So you can kind of see the similarity and how that connects, right?
Oh, so much similarity there, right? But yeah, go ahead.
So we have this anointing oil that is used for forgiveness of sins or atonement, which of course brings to mind Jesus as the Christ with the chrism oil, and he provides forgiveness as well. And as in Exodus 30, this is all tied to the scapegoat, isn't it? Or is that another chapter, actually?
Pharmacosis, I don't know if it's tied to the Exodus 30. I don't think it's in there, but that all kind of starts to occur. But, the Hebrew term Messiah, that means the anointed one, and the Greek translation of that's Christ. I didn't want to go into, like, I have written about the continued use of this holy oil into the Christian period. I just kind of touched on it this book, just because it's so complicated talking about Jesus Christ nowadays. Everybody's goes all Caesar Messiah on you, and there's a lot to cover. And it was just, I figured it'd be better for another book if I'm going to approach it again, rather than this one further. It's already so big.
I really hope you do, just because, like, your book you don't really even go there, but anyone who's familiar and reads it closely will notice so many parallels between this goddess worship cult that you discuss throughout your book and the later Christian cult. You know,
Yeah.
they're almost,
Sophia
to
was
me, it
like,
seems
like
like you were saying, right?
Christianity was
Jesus
kind of
comes out of
polytheistic.
that Asherah cult that never got fully wiped out. What
Yeah,
do you
absolutely.
think?
Yeah. Yeah, well, Sophia, they've, people that the wisdom literature think it's kind of carried over from the wisdom literature, which was goddess influenced in the Hebrew material, right? So, yeah, it's pretty, I don't think, the way it came down through Christianity with Mary and stuff, that it kind of carries the same sort of weight or influence, you know what I mean? It's also patriarchal.
There's
But
clearly
early
a usurpation that happens, right? But if we
yeah,
look at like a lot of the earliest texts, like you're so familiar with the Wretch, like a lot of that Gnostic literature
yeah.
seems to be very much related to these earlier goddess cults.
Absolutely, like the thunder of the perfect mind is a great text. I am the horn, I am the holy one. It's like goddess worship central to Gnosticism. Mary Magdalene was the premier disciple, just as Peter and Paul were in mainstream Christianity. And there's a whole other type of scenario of again of like a polytheistic culture suppressing down to monotheistic culture, a repeat of what happened. The Romans were dealing with the Gauls and all these different things. They got so spread out as an empire. Again, the centralized worship, one religion, one worship. It's politically motivated in both cases.
That's such a good point. What I want to
Yeah.
ask you, sorry, you want to say something, Rich?
Well, it just brought to mind that there's also another supposed wife of God, Anata Yahu, and we can read in the Ugaritic text that the goddess Anat uses an ointment ritually and seems to be tripping out there, or in some kind of ecstatic state, and so it's all over the place, and then the Gnostics are using these sexual rituals that are more than likely rooted in the Asherah or Kadesha sacred prostitution cults of Judaism, or at least take some influence. They're drawing from all over the place.
Yeah,
The
I
Gnostics,
kind
but
of think that it was like, in a lot of ways, if you take a look at Gnostic Christianity, it's a return to the early polytheistic kind of pantheon. The serpent, Yahweh's the bad guy in that scenario, and the serpent's the giver of wisdom, and the goddess is his mother, and it's all pretty much back to the old ways. And I agree. I think that, even the earliest Gnostic sects, some of them use terms like the Levites and the Ophites, those are the oldest Gnostic texts. And that's where a lot of the sexual practice, you can read whole books by Elaine Pagels and other Gnostic scholars, and you'd never know that they were these like erotic practicing Gnostic groups. You have to kind of dig a little bit deeper to go back to the original texts and the condemnations of these groups by the Catholic Church Fathers, or maybe read some German, researchers like Kurt Rudolph, who go into more detail about spermo-Gnosticism. It's like, and there's even texts where Jesus is depicted, like the Question of Mary, where Jesus himself is depicted as partaking in these erotic Gnostic sperm rites.
Oh, this is
yeah,
something we've actually talked about here on our show. Dion and I did an episode on spermatophagy, more dealing with more modern interpretations that were coming out of a lot of this French Martinist schools. I
Yeah,
can't
well, that's
remember
all
that.
based on the Gnostic stuff.
Of
It's
course.
and when I first heard about it, I was like, no way, you know what I mean? And then eventually you get to the text, and it's like, holy whoa! And once you read those, the condemnations, it opens up a lot of avenues of interpretation of Gnostic texts themselves, and you can kind of see they're making reference to it. They're talking more esoterically, like these are their secret rites. You know what I mean? They're talking more esoterically, but it's pretty clearly intertwined. This is something I dealt with a lot in my book, Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible. I had a lot of material on, at that time, I think it was the most in-depth look at the different material relating to that in print. But I think Tobias Churton now has a book out on Gnostic sex rites. I've only looked at the table of contents, but it looks like he's covered the material pretty well. I don't know what his end interpretation of it is. But yeah, it's pretty wild stuff. Like few people realize, like for the first few centuries, there was like full on sex cults that consider themselves Christians. You know what I mean?
Well,
It comes as a real shock to modern Christians, I think.
like
Yeah,
one thing we're all friends
most
with. Go ahead, sir, Rich.
I was just going to say the main argument that scholars seem to have against that is just, well, ancients would never do this stuff because it's so unseemly, and we wouldn't do it, so they wouldn't do it.
Well, people say, "Oh, it's all metaphorical," like, and it's like, no, it's
Yeah.
not. It's just like you can see this thing in other cultures. A lot of the stuff similar to tantric practices. There's a lot to it, man. And some of these, the bridal chamber, all this type of stuff is pretty clearly wound up with sex rights.
Well, one of
Yeah.
our good friends here, Dr. Ammon, who I know you've cited his work.
I know
he's
him. I know him personally. Like I've met him in
Yeah.
real life. I brought him to Vancouver to speak at a conference. He was David Hillman back then. He's in my documentary on Cannabis and some of my other documentaries.
amazing. Yeah, so you got to check out his latest stuff because he's mostly been doing it all through lectures on YouTube. He wants to give it away for free for everyone, but he's basically utilizing his discovery of this Orphic Vox, which is like this secretive cult language of Dionysus, and using that to interpret a lot of these texts, specifically a lot of Christian texts like the Book of Revelation. But what he's looking for in his showing is like these sex rites that were perpetuated from the ancient Bronze Age forward, and they involve either the consumption of semen or the consumption of a female ejaculate.
Yeah.
And you see kind of two versions of this rite going in either direction. Have you come across anything like that? What do you think of something?
Gnostics use both. You know what I mean? It's like semen and menstrual fluid are described. Yeah. At that time, they thought doing it. Well, I think there's indications of these practices in the fertility rites, you know what I mean? But nothing that's concretely as descriptive as, say, as the church fathers' descriptions of the Gnostics and what they were doing, or Hippolytus or some of these other guys that wrote about it. They're pretty clear on what was going on. And, there's definitely, like other cultures, there's indications of practices like this in Egypt. And that's all this stuff. Gnosticism was kind of like what the New Age is now. Back then, where it was adapting just everything, Greek, Egyptian, any Babylonian, whatever they could get could be incorporated into the cosmology. And when we talk about the term, Gnosticism, it's important for people to know that this is like a blanket term. Not all the Gnostics were practicing these sex rites, just specific sects like the Ophites, Nazarenes, Levites, some of these other ones, Barbalodioites or whatever. There's just so many of them. I don't even know all the names. But they're, Gnosticism is kind of a blanket term for anybody that didn't end up in the Roman Catholic Church canon. You know what I mean? So some of the Gnostics were very ascetic and completely anti-sex. But the Gnostics that practice sex, a lot of it had to do with the idea that light descends into matter, and then through a series of incarnation, mineral, vegetable, animal, and then man. When it's in man, it has the opportunity to return to light. But if you procreate and plant your seed and create children, you're causing the entrapment of light into matter. But if you retain it all and maybe take some more in, you build up a body of light, and then you ascend through the archons to the kingdom of light eventually. And so it's kind of wound up with that kind of a belief. In Crowleyan sex magic, it kind of evolves into something like you could focus your will. Say there's something you want to accomplish, and you could focus your will into that, and that would drive a message of something into that, right? And then if you took it back into yourself and give birth in it to yourself, and you'd have the will to complete that act, right? So it's a little bit different than what the Gnostics had.
It's interesting though that you bring up Crowley, because he also kind of speculated on this ancient rite of consumption of menses in sperm, right?
Well,
it's such a huge part. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, he's influenced by those French guys you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm trying to think of some of their names off the top of my head.
Georges de Saint Clement, I think, or something.
Yeah.
One guy.
Yeah.
There's
a bunch of them. And that was a big thing back then. Well, there's also like von Hammer Purgstell's Mysterium Baphometus, which was written in 1818, and it put forth, and that's where a lot of this Gnostic stuff started to arrive, is after von Hammer-Purgstall's book, Mysterium Baphometus. He suggested that the Templar, when they were in the Holy Land, they rediscovered these Gnostic rites, and that the reasons for the accusations of sodomy and stuff like that against the Templar, and the source of their heresy accusations was their adoption of these Gnostic texts, and that Baphometus itself was a dark form of Sophia. And that you can rearrange, you do some numerological thing, and Baphometus winds up as Sophia, according to von Hammer-Purgstall, and also the guy, Professor Hugh Schoenfield, made a similar claim about the name Baphometus being connected to Sophia. It's debatable, but it's interesting.
Well,
definitely.
on that. Chris, on that point, I can confirm. I know how they do it. It's called the Atbash cipher. So what you do is you take the first letter of the alphabet, in this case Aleph, and then whenever you see that, you replace it with the last letter of the alphabet, and the second letter, Beth, with the second last letter. Okay, so if you do that for Baphomet, it does transliterate to Sophia. There's no you can do this yourself at home if you just look at the alphabets. So there's no, it definitely says that. Whether or not that's what the secret mysteries are about.
Whether that's whether that's just by chance or by thing. But the Templars are another fascinating things. The whole Cathari influence on some of the Gnostics, and that's the Templar, and that's again kind of like a carryover of Gnosticism. And interestingly, in Liber 420, I show that the Templar had cannabis being grown for them by Arabs in Spain, and it was seized at both the French Templar site and the English Templar site as well when they were raided.
Right. There's so much interesting stuff, too, that a lot of people forget about the Islamic tradition, because I know I've read a lot of this scholar, Alain Danilou, who talks about how the Sufi tradition...
He's one of my favorite guys. His book on Dionysius and Shiva, that's great stuff, man.
Right. And he talks about this a lot, how basically the Sufi groups are an offshoot of these Dionysian ecstatic cults. They're doing the same dances. They're playing the exact same music, almost verbatim, and they have the cannabis and hashish rites as well as sacred wine, which is, and the wine one is the interesting one, because cannabis, we know, was generally accepted among the Muslims until later, but the wine was always vilified, yet the Sufis maintained it,
Yeah, it was kind of like tantric almost, and, like a breaking cultural taboos,
right.
As part of that. Well, the Sufis, they would travel around with bands of sadhus. And they were like all interwound up. There's even ancient depictions of them all together, sadhus, fakirs, all mixed together. Taking hash, drinking wine, whatever. And the connection between Dionysius and Shiva as well is, that as you mentioned, Danilou, he wrote about that. I don't know if he was the first to write about it in a book, but there's a few books on that. And this goes back to the time of Alexander. Man, they thought then it was already much more ancient than their time period when they were talking about it. So it's pretty interwound, and you got to think it's not surprising that there'd be similarities like that some of these different religions could have started from something earlier. We see this with Soma and Haoma specifically in the Avesta. It's Haoma, and there's the whole mythology in the Rig Veda. It's Soma. There's a whole mythology, but there's overlaps of the same gods appearing and some of the same myths, but there's also differences, right? You know what I mean? And it's take a look at language, right? You know what I mean? French, English, German, Vedic Indian, they all started as Indo-European language, and people moved to different areas, and then it took on its different dialects. And that doesn't take that long, you know what I mean, before people living over here that separated from the same group, they can't understand each other 4 or 5 centuries later. You know what I mean? Same thing with gods and goddesses. They take their god over there, but things happen, and let's add that to this myth and adapt that for this, and pretty soon there's similarities and differences, but you can kind of see enough similarities to identify that this originates with something earlier. I think this is pretty clear with goddesses like Ishtar, Asherah, Asherah, that they all go back to something much, much, much more ancient. And the common use of cannabis in all of these cults is pretty indicative of the extent and how far back that goes. You know what I mean? It was something that was in the original that split off, you know?
Right, for sure.
Right.
Well, like the goddess imagery is something that is so primordial. It even predates like modern hominids. In that area, like there's those Venus figurines everywhere. And I mean, a lot of that we're dealing with speculation, but I think it's important that we recognize this kind of image that survives. Right, that
Yeah.
mother goddess image
It's,
evolves in the
it's the only
Kybalites.
type of art that's appearing for like thousands
Right,
of years. You know what I mean? It's pretty clear
exactly.
there's like a central form of worship. The worship of Sybil, man, that's just like so ancient, man. 8,000-10,000 years, cattle Hayek type stuff, and they found evidence of cannabis there as well.
Right.
Oh, did they?
Yeah,
Okay.
cannabis cloth, not like
Oh, right.
ritual use of cannabis, but they found, and which is interesting because it's like 10,000 years old, kind of that range. And we find cannabis cloth in Taiwan around the same time, 10,000 BC. So these diverse cultures are already utilizing this plant in similar ways by this time, which indicates
Yeah.
it's like just so much, much, much more ancient,
Yeah, it's so ubiquitous. And then we can see that there's pretty clearly Canaanite, Egyptian, and Zoroastrian influences on Judaism, and they all seem to have been using cannabis, so of
Yeah.
course Jews did. It's everywhere else. How could they escape
Particularly
it?
the Assyrian stuff, you know what I mean? It's almost like a similar type when you read like the description of the sacred rites and then compare that with the Exodus kind of account and the indications that, are that it was kind of just an extension of that same sort of worship in Israel until monotheism became the flavor of the day.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's one thing I wanted to ask you a little more about, actually, because this monotheism thing is so interesting. And you brought up like it's kind of a process of that happens over time. But I have read a lot of scholars that argue that after the Exodus into Babylon, that when they return, that's really when the monotheism takes root. And a lot of this was instilled by the Persians to create a buffer state to protect themselves from Egypt. What are
Yeah,
your
I
thoughts
agree.
on that
I
scholarship?
think there was attempts at instilling monotheism, but it never really took root.
Hmm.
And this is something I discuss in relation to Ezra and his cup of fire. It's like similar to the Zoroastrian accounts of people drinking these bang infused wines, and it's like it was very successful in Zoroastrianism. Was another situation of where like kind of polytheistic and comes down to it as sort of a monotheism. Although I don't, people say Zoroastrianism is a monotheism, but it's not exactly a monotheism, but close enough.
Mhm.
It's got the one central god there, Ahura Mazda, that was kind of in domination. I think the idea is that became so successful that they copied that in different territories, and over here maybe Marduk is used. Over here, it's in this area with these Hebrew guys is Yahweh, and that when Ezra is described as going back to the Holy Land, he was a scribe, to the Persians. When they send him back, it's like the people there, they don't know anything about monotheism. They're like worshiping polytheistic, just as it was done before it was all split up. And he had to instill it and separate them from their foreign wives and things like that. But there's no evidence that there was monotheism ever there before the time of the Persian return, and that could well again have been more political influences getting down to that. So I see the Hezekiah and Josiah historical attempts at doing it, and then Zoroastrian, and I think from there, it just people started kind of paying more attention to that model, and eventually, through Christianity, Roman Empire, and whatnot, again, boom, monotheism, and here we are.
Yeah, we seem to have like there's several attempts at monotheism that happen, right? You can also talk about like the cult of Akhenaten in
Yeah.
Egypt, right? And then we could also even make it.
My book, Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible, I was really into the Akhenaten theory that Sigmund Freud, he's the one that came up with the idea that Moses is monotheism. He's got a book, I think it's Moses and Monotheism, Freud, and he suggested that Akhenaten was where it got picked up. And we know that Akhenaten had Semites in his kingdom, and sometimes in authoritative roles in, like in the structure of the society, in important responsibility positions. So there's no doubt. And we also, things like they found like temples relating to Enki, where this is a big influence on the whole Garden of Eden mythology in Armana, the city of Akhenaten. So there's all the elements are there. And there, I'm not sure I believe in a historical Moses myself. I think that, it's a creation of Hezekiah, Josiah period. There's no, indications the Hebrews had any knowledge of the laws of Moses up until after the time of Josiah, when they found the book of Deuteronomy and stuff, But there may have been, maybe there was some influence of that. Maybe it carried over. But in my first book, I definitely considered Moses a historical figure and treated a lot of it quite literally. But I kind of think, as you were saying, a lot of it's later with the Persians and stuff like that, and you can't really, it might be like a composite figure created out of a variety of group leaders and stuff.
Yeah, it seems to be like a pattern, because then we also have the other place that I see the monotheism coming from is coming from the Greek philosophy, specifically Platonism, which is arguing for that noble lie in this kind of setting up of a rigid patriarchal hierarchy. And, it kind of sets up this, what we see later with the Christians, this idea of us against them and that perpetual warfare, and this idea that we have to dominate everyone around us and create a global kind of government, so there's a lot of where this, it's hard to say exactly, but you see all of these elements. There's definitely something coming from Egypt, from Persia, and coming from the Greeks and Romans as well, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. All sorts of, everybody you come into contact with, it's like,
it's a terrifying prospect, and you were right to identify like this loss of the cannabis and this loss of the feminine caused so much violence across the world, right?
Absolutely. Unbalanced society, like we're like, it's all male dominated and it's not working.
Right. But I wanted to open up the questions to Dion. You have yet to talk about anything. Do you have anything you want to ask of Chris?
Oh, well, I got a series of questions, and we'll see which one you find the most interesting.
Sure. Number
one is there a relationship, male and female, between frankincense and cannabis?
I never explored anything like that. I'm assuming the frankincense was burnt to Yahweh and the cannabis was burnt to Asherah because of, by the time of Jeremiah 6:20, although cannabis had been initially praised and part of the temple use and whatnot, by the time Jeremiah 6:20, he's like, what do I care from your canna from a distant land? Your incense of Sheba does not please me. Your canna and frankincense from a different land. This is one of the references where both of those appear together. And specifically at the time where the cancellation of the temples happening with the cannabis and frankincense temples, right? And then in Jeremiah 44, he's in conflict with Israelites who had escaped to Egypt and were settled there. This is all during the Babylonian attack and the crushing of Jerusalem and stuff like that. And he blames them for the fall of Jerusalem because they were burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her. And this whole burning incense, and you continue to burn incense to the Queen of Heaven, and the crowd responds, sure, we burned incense to the Queen of Heaven, as did the kings and princes before us and our fathers and mothers, as we always have done, and so it's pretty clearly wound up with that, right? So in that sense, that's where I'm really tying it in with the cult of Asherah. Is that reference there, and then the same indication in the Temple of Ra. And also there's an archaeological site that's related to Asherah where there's indications of ritual production of hemp cloth. And this is something that's made reference to in the women wove clothing for Asherah in the temple grounds and stuff like that, which is indicative of, again, of a plant with both fibrous and entheogenic properties. So in that sense, I think there is something there, but like on a more physical or scientific or other esoteric system basis, no, I haven't. But cannabis is definitely a female energy because we're taking the female plant specifically.
Right.
It's a sexed plant, right? There's not that many plants that are male and female, and cannabis is one of those.
Awesome. And so I got another question. July 23rd, today, I noticed I was looking into Dogon culture because I tried to go to Mali, and I was going to the Dogon sacred sites in Africa.
Cool.
And they consider today that there's an alignment with Sirius, the sun, and the earth, which is a straight line with the universe. And that's the dog star is connected to cannabis.
And that whole thing, the idea two dog star cannabis, that's just fucking bullshit.
This is etymology, just taking a connection.
Fact. It's like, Jack Harris is a pioneer, and I knew him, and he wrote the foreword for my first book, but sometimes he just, came up with some crazy logic. You won't find a single serious etymologist or linguist that chases the etymology to two dog star for cannabis. There's like so much known about the etymology of cannabis. Even the page on Wiki is actually pretty good. If you look at that, they have a page on the etymology of cannabis, but it clearly goes back to Indo-European roots. And you can follow the spread of the term spreading out into different languages, in Europe and then in the East and stuff like that, pretty clearly, so I don't hold any weight into that. And I've tried to find, actual references to the Dogon's use of cannabis and how it fits in, but it's hard to find anything from like an actual anthropologist or anything like that. I've been unable to, and it's something I'm always looking at, cannabis references and digging up stuff, and I couldn't find a lot to substantiate that. No, I'm not saying there isn't. That, but I haven't been able to find anything from a serious researcher that's not somebody that's like some pro cannabis activist or what I mean, somebody like myself or something that you can do it. And that's like something I'm always like looking for is like actual archaeological talking about it, or actual historians or anthropologists, and not people that are going to have some sort of biased interpretation.
Awesome. Because I've heard that for years, that mythology. There's books and everything about it, Yeah. And so one last question. Canna as a measuring rod, I saw the reference to that, and then Sheshat, the goddess in Egypt, with their hemp ropes to measure. Measuring time. Is there something there?
Yeah, there could be. You know what I mean? I didn't go into it in this book, but I have gone into it earlier. It's not just a measuring rod. A lot of times, it's like a rope, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
A bundle of rope, because you could measure longer lengths with a bundle of rope if you follow the measure of the rod down that way. I think there is a connection there. You know what I mean? These are important symbols and stuff. There's just so much to cover that anytime I talk about something like that, I've got to like lay out all this stuff to kind of make it sort of, and I just was trying to like keep the book. My publisher wanted me to write something like 300 pages, because Liber 420 was 777 pages. People barely read little books now, let alone big, thick books. And my publisher was hoping for something a little more mainstream. So I didn't go into some detail, and that's something that I left out of this book that I kind of thought maybe I should have mentioned that, but it would have taken a lot of illustrations and whatnot to do it. But I do discuss that in Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible.
I just want to say, like, I love that you went all out with 420. Like, that's one of my all-time favorite occult books ever, just because unlike a lot of occult books, you're citing all of your sources and you're putting them in context, and it's a ridiculous the amount of sources. It's like a literal Bible. You go through everything.
Yeah. When I started that book, I thought I would just be, I thought maybe I'd be able to get a chapter or two on the medieval Renaissance material, and then the whole focus would be the 19th century. But then when I wrote it, I just came across all this medieval and Renaissance material, alchemical texts in Latin with cannabis references, and grimoires in Latin with cannabis that nobody'd written about before. And it took up most of the book. And then unfortunately, I had a load of 19th century material that got left out on the back burner. I had a huge chapter on Crowley and hashish that never made it into the book that I probably published at some point somewhere in something else. But there's like in the 19th century there, like Eliphas Levi, Pappas, so many of these guys, Blavatsky, so many of these people have little cannabis connections and stuff. There's like, you could write a whole book on drugs in the 19th century. I don't think there would be a 19th century occult revolution without hashish and other drugs, but particularly hashish's influence,
Yeah, no, definitely, right? Like the influence of cannabis cannot be understated. One reference from 420 that immediately stood out to me was the connection to Robin Goodfellow and the whole myth, that whole mythology of like Robin Hood. Like I never realized that had all of that ancient pagan and cannabis connection. Just something I took for granted.
Old poems and stuff like that, or the kind of raunchy, kind of sexy poems with hemp stuff in it. That's fascinating stuff. Shakespeare was aware of that. He worked it into his big thing with Puck and everybody. Puck's Robin Goodfellow. Even has a hemp reference in Midsummer Night's Dream, that's another interesting connection as well, the whole Shakespeare thing.
Right. There's so much of this encoded language with these entheogens across history. But go ahead, Reg, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, it goes on and on. There's so much in Liber 420. And then, like you're saying, you can write a whole book just on the 19th century alone.
Yeah.
So, but we can see it in the grimoires. They're using it for scrying. They're using it to see spirits, which is same in line with how Taoist medical texts talk about it, using it to see spirits and ghosts. So
the Picatrix, that's probably the foundational document of the Western magical tradition, and it's got it right in there. It's like cannabis resins burnt to bring down the servant of the moon before you in the smoke. So it's right in there, and that's sort of suffumigation. That's the same thing that's happening with Moses in the tent of the meeting, and is happening in Tel Arad. That's just a continuation of that process.
Yeah, we can see this quite clearly in the Greek magical papyri with the 8th book of Moses. It doesn't mention cannabis explicitly, but it talks about hotboxing incense in this ritual tent of Moses, and it's very, syncretic and paganized. But those Greek magical papyri influenced both the Solomonic magic and the Raziel grimoires, which we also do see. Liber Salomonis is a Raziel grimoire, and we do see cannabis use again for scrying.
For mirror scrying again. You know what I mean? It's like the relationship between cannabis and magic mirrors went on for centuries. That's what Pascal Beverly Randolph and Louis Alphonse Cahagnet. That's what a lot of these French occultists were into. That's how they specifically used hashish, was for mirror scrying, and it's like you stare into a black mirror until you started to see things and experience things from staring into this black opaque mirror. And drugs help that. I think that mirror scrying is actually an avenue that modern entheogens might apply entheogens in, because it is a very effective tool, and it goes back to agent references as well.
I just want to point out we all basically have a black mirror in our pocket, so you just pull it out, get stoned, and go to town. It's just funny. No, but like you're right. Like there's so much interesting stuff with a lot. One of the things that I think a lot of modern occultists lost was that entheogenic connection. It was removed or hidden and obscured behind symbolic language. And why it's
people are downright hostile to the idea. You know what I mean? Witches are hostile. Neo-pagan witches hostile to the idea of entheogenic substances being used in rituals, which is preposterous.
Absolutely right. Like these are supposed to be medicine women, but also it's like we're so prudish. But when you read the text, like especially in regards to witches, we read about things about them taking suppositories, drug and theogenic suppositories, in order to fly and see the devil, right? Like, it's pretty radical stuff these women are doing. They're doing datura, not regular psychedelics. These are deliriants, right?
Well, Amlon, he suggests that, that was part of like Aphrodite worship in ancient Greece, was, fumigating the yoni with, hembane and datura and all sorts of potent things, including cannabis.
Oh, for sure. And there's so much speculation when we're dealing with a lot of this stuff because, anything that deals with the feminization, especially in regards to men, gets really obscured. I've even read some scholars that argue that some of the Norse magic, because there's so much shame and it's related to cross-dressing, that there's probably a suppository involved there, because, where a priestess has to put the man in a submissive sexual position in order for them to have the religious experience. And that wouldn't be surprising, I don't think.
Well, in the end, these things are secret rites, you know what I mean? So It's not like a lot of this stuff was explicitly written about, magic revealed is magic lost, and that's something that all shamans kind of try to keep their bag of tricks kind of hidden, So that's not an uncommon feature of a lot of this stuff, that the obscurification, the purposeful obscurification of it.
Then there's the fact that most of what we know about the Norse and the Celts comes from Christian sources who are purposely misleading people or, just don't understand. So
yeah. We see a similar thing we say with the Hashishins and assassins, the Marco Polo references. These are like demonized references to the use of these types of things, but they may at the same time unveil behind them some sort of history about their use as well.
Right. So we're coming up to the hour mark, so I just want to start winding down here. So does any Dion or Wretch, do either of you guys have last questions for Chris?
I would like to say kudos, real quick, kudos for your new book.
Thanks.
If you remove cannabis from it, it's a history. Just on a historical level, the research on its own can stand alone.
Wonderful. Thanks.
Just telling everyone out there.
Yeah, I tried to stick with, up with the current historical views from biblical scholars and stuff like that about the origins, the ideas of polytheism and Asherah. None of that's like radically mine. It's just, kind of what people know now.
Yeah, to reiterate, Chris has read all the scholarship basically, and to my mind, he probably knows more about the history of cannabis than anybody alive on the planet, or even in the past, because he has global awareness. So definitely want to encourage people to check out his books. I would like you to talk about Ezra a little bit more and how he wrote the Bible after the captivity, because whatever you want to say about Moses or Israel, well, we got these interesting stories about Ezra here.
Well, like Moses, when God first appears to Moses, he appears within a burning bush. And Ezra, likewise, is described as first hearing the voice of God from a bush. You know what I mean? So there's a connection there that ties him back to Moses. And then he's commanded to drink this fiery cup, and he drinks it. And then he has given the wisdom to put the books in the right order and include what should be included and all that type of stuff according to the account, and what's interesting there is Ezra was a scribe of the Persians, and we know from Zoroastrian texts like the book of Ardu Viraf or the account of Vishtaspa that it was a practice for the elites in the Zoroastrian tradition when there was trouble in the land or something going on in the kingdom to seek wisdom from beyond. And this was done by drinking 7 golden cups infused with mang or bang, the descriptions are. And this is thought to be a word related to cannabis, to the Indian term banga as well, infused in wine. And then he would lie down as if dead. And, it's important to remember that cannabis-infused wine is, in fact, the first anesthetic that we know of. It's written in the Chinese period of the 1st century. The guy was doing operations using cannabis-infused wine. So it knocked them out, and then they would wake up and they'd say what they'd seen in relation to what they'd been sent to find out. That's kind of like, it's also, Mircea Eliade suggests that such events, that's where the belief in the soul originated, was when people would have some sort of, in the Zoroastrian account, you leave the body. Well, what's leaving the body? You know what I mean? It's like, so there's something that could leave and have this whole other experience. Well, your body, we saw your body was right there. You weren't over at the Sinvat Bridge. You were right, but no, I was, and I saw this. So this is something that contributed, as well as dreaming, to the idea of a soul could leave the body and continue on its existence. It's pretty clearly used, an infused wine in the Zoroastrian tradition. And a number of scholars, a century apart, George Washington Brown and what's his name, Brazilian researcher. Oh man, I've forgotten the guy's name offhand here. It doesn't matter, but another Brazilian researcher, biblical scholar, both suggested that this was a cannabis infusion, and this is the basis of it, and used the same sort of Zoroastrian connection. Vicente de Braca, that's the Brazilian researcher that I'm reading.
Oh, yeah.
And his papers on Ezra are really great to read, as is George Washington Brown's account, which I've reprinted in there. I've got some excerpts from Dubraca, but I would recommend for people interested in that to read that paper that Dubraca himself wrote, because it goes into much more detail in it, and it fits with the idea that monotheism came via the Persians as well.
Yeah, I mean, from my own research, it's pretty easy to see that this Art of Araf text is the Zoroastrian equivalent to the apocalyptic literature and to even Merkabah traditions. There must be some kind of influence going on there from the Persian.
Vishtaspa specifically is like thought to influence the Book of Revelation. There was the Oracle of Hystaspes, which is the Greek version of the Vishtaspa, and Vishtaspa was a king who was said to be Zoroastrian's first convert, and Vishtaspa had a vision of the end of the world. It became prohibited literature because it predicted the downfall of Rome. That's what the Book of Revelation does too, right? Babylon's Rome. Babylon had been long gone, but because they saw what happened with the Oracle of Hystaspes, they knew they sure didn't want to say Rome in there, kind of get it destroyed pretty quick and draw the heat on you pretty quick. But there's definitely some sort of relationship there, just as Ezekiel, before his great vision, he's given a scroll, he eats it, tastes as sweet as honey, turns bitter in his stomach, and he begins to have his vision. Same thing with John in Revelation, given a scroll, the exact repeat of the Ezekiel account. Either they work that in there as a direct copy, or it's describing a technique of ecstasy that was repeated up to that time,
Yeah, there's no shortage of texts of mystics having out-of-body experiences or visions, especially after eating some magic plant or thing, potion or some such thing. So,
I think that, when you really understand the role of entheogens in the formation of the world's religions, that it's as much a threat to fundamental religion as Darwin's theory of evolution was to the myth of Adam and Eve in Genesis, because what it shows is the plant-based, entheogenic, shamanic origins of religion itself. And that's something that these Abrahamic religions have rallied against since their inception and fossilization into their concrete forms as books.
That's so well said. Thank you for saying that, honestly, because I couldn't agree more, and just to expand on that, the removal of entheogens allowed them to reduce the imagination. It allowed us to be disconnected from our dreams and from our bodies. It allowed us to believe in nothing but the dark. Like if you look at a lot of this, especially the more extreme versions of Christianity or any of the Abrahamic religions, they reduce you to almost a slave mentality, and they remove any joy from your life. They disconnect you from the world, fundamentally from the nature. And that is at the heart of everything we're facing. We have no connection to the mother, to our planet Earth, right?
Yeah, well, this is, and they fear the return of it. You know what I mean? In a lot of ways, Lady Babylon holding up her cup of abomination is that ancient goddess Ishtar, holding up her entheogenic sacraments and stuff like that. And the fear is the fall of the patriarchy if we return to these sorts of things.
Well, you know,
And that's what we're trying to do here.
right? And, you know, if the Sibylline oracles are right, then, you know, those poles are going to be flipped again. And there's going to be that child to come that Crowley talks about, you know? We just need to get through this next apocalypse, right?
There we go. That'd be good.
But thank you so much, Chris. This has been
My
a
pleasure.
incredibly wonderful discussion. You know, I mean, we could talk to you for just hours and hours, but I just also want to end.
Sometime.
Yeah, I would love to have you back. You know, maybe we can get you in with Dr. Ammon as well. That would be a lot of fun. But like, I just also want to emphasize, like, part of the reason why your books I find are so profound is because you're approaching this subject from sort of three perspectives. On one hand, it's extraordinarily academic. You go through your book Cannabis, you're citing every couple sentences. There's another citation. You can't refute it. And on top of that, you're approaching it as a psychonaut yourself, someone who lives this life, who's fought for people's rights and who sold it the whole nine. And then you're also operating from a spiritual practitioner as well. So you have the three perspectives that, you know, a lot of people are missing one or the other, right? You're giving a very non-biased, organic book here that tells you about the entire history of the ancient religion and how we wound up where we are, you know? And we'll just show everyone again here the Amazon page. You know, the first book there is Cannabis and the Soma Solution, but the second book here, this is the one we've been talking about today, Cannabis, the Lost Sacrament of the Ancient World, just had a re-release, and the hardcover is coming out on 4/20, so that's pretty epic. So everyone, please go and support Chris. If you also look in the links below, there's a link to his cannabis culture blog, which you've been doing for like 10 years plus now. That's where I first found you, was just searching random religious stuff online, and then you're writing about Soma. No one else was really doing that back in the day. So anyone else have any last words for Chris before we say goodbye?
I brought a friend,
Absolutely.
lemon cherry gelato, in honor of you.
Well, I think that's good for today. I just want to also encourage everybody to check out Chris's books, because even if you have no interest in cannabis, you need to read this to understand the history of Judaism, as far as I'm concerned. You cannot otherwise.
Right.
So
Telerad's pivotal, I think, in understanding what took place, and it's an important thing. It's a shame that when that news came out, was right in the midst of COVID and Trump tweeting every 20 minutes, and kind of got lost in the shuffle. And I think it would have had a bigger impact on a quieter news day.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who want to sweep it under the rug, no doubt. But this is why we got to spread the word.
Right. And you're doing just that. So thanks again, Chris, for all of your research, your writing, and your activism. It means a lot to us, and you are helping to change the world. So everyone, please go out and buy Chris's books, and we'll see you again soon. So peace, love, and hail Satan. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.